Hello and welcome to another episode of It Came From the Page. I've been watching, well, technically I've been reading a lot of Dracula in the last few months. I intended for this month to only be reading like Dracula, Frankenstein, other Universal monster stuff. About when I got to the 20th, when I go through all these books, I'll tell you the book that kind of stalled me a bit because it wasn't so great. But it started out really good, and then I think I got to about the 20th, and then I kind of switched up what I was reading and listening to. So I thought for this episode, I would just talk about the Dracula books that I did read, and then when I do my month wrap up, I will talk about every non-Dracula book I read. Wasn't much because if you look at the pile, like I got through quite a few books this month. So let's get started. So starting off, the Hounds of Dracula. This is actually a novelization for Zoltan, the Hound of Dracula, but because it has a different title, I would imagine that you would probably pick this up and not realize it was a novelization. Now at the bottom it says now a major motion picture, but that makes it seem like it was adapted from this, but this is a novelization. There's a lot of talk about how novelizations instantly equal trash because you need extra information to go into it, and this is one of the books that I would definitely point to as a counterpoint to that, because you don't need any additional information going into this. It doesn't even have the same title as the movie. If you just picked this up and read it, you would just think this is a cheesy, pulpy novel about Dracula's dog. You don't need any information that this was ever a movie. So I think people don't realize that novelizations are normally adaptations of a script, not even actually the physical movie itself. So 90% of novelizations are written without ever even seeing the finished project. So I don't know how people can say you need extra information going in. I think most novelizations stand on their own. This one especially. It's fun. It's fun. It's breezy. It's not too long. It's only about, so it's about 170 pages. It's the perfect length for a book like this. So the basic plot of Hounds of Dracula is that way back in the day when old-timey Dracula was running around, he took over a Doberman, a little Doberman pinscher, who was this little great dog. His name was Zoltan. He was a great dog. And because he was such a good dog, Dracula had to bite him and turn him into his dog, so he became Dracula's dog. And it starts out where these, soldiers are going through these tombs, and they accidentally unearth the tomb of the Draculas. And the first one that gets freed because somebody decides to rip the stake out of their chest is Zoltan. And then Zoltan is the only one who escapes. He brings out his old master, who wasn't a Dracula, but was his owner before Dracula. But I guess Dracula also buried him nearby. I don't know. That part doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think this is a really fun and funny book because Zoltan then goes to hunt down the last remaining person from the Dracula bloodline, which is this guy in the United States, whose family had moved ages ago, changed their names, and he didn't even know he was the relative of Dracula until this dog comes to look for him, and he wants to turn him into a Dracula so that he has a new master. It's very funny. It's very cheesy. If you've never seen the movie, I love the movie Zoltan, Hound of Dracula, and this one is pretty close. There's not a whole lot of differences from the movie. I think if you just went in to read this for a good time, though, you would be pretty happy. The only two Frankenstein books I read this month were The Rivals of Frankenstein and In Search of Frankenstein. Last month I read In Search of Dracula as well. Both of these are kind of sister books. They are kind of... In Search of Dracula is covering the historical Dracula and the history of the historical Dracula. This one is studying and examining the Frankenstein legacy. In Search of Dracula is basically really a exhaustive history of the historical Dracula, who, in a later book I read, they really kind of hammer home that this doesn't have a lot to do with the Dracula of Bram Stoker's vision, but since the release of this book, the entire mythos of Dracula now gets tied into the historical Dracula. So this book is essential reading now, and it's also really good reading. Like, I really love the explorations of like Romanian folklore in this book, and I love the history of this book because I'm a kind of a history nerd. But it doesn't have to do that much with the Bram Stoker's Dracula, because really Bram Stoker just came by a name and was like, "Oh, cool, I'm gonna name this guy Count Dracula." Like, he had already had a count. Most of the story was kind of in his head before he even ran across the name Dracula. And I do think this book is really worth reading. It's not too expensive. You can find this book pretty cheap places. Like, if you're a history nerd. In Search of Frankenstein is the one that people kind of forget exists. I think kind of for good reason. I think this is a really good book and a really interesting book, but I don't think it's as vital to pop culture as In Search of Dracula is, because In Search of Dracula really kind of changed the discussion of what we perceived Dracula as in media. Whereas In Search of Frankenstein, not so much. It's more of an interesting footnote, and a lot of the things that it kind of presupposes, some of the themes, like the quote-unquote revelations it has, I don't really believe in a lot of this stuff, right? Because it tries to make it this a conspiracy that, like, in Mary Shelley's, like, journals, she intentionally left off of a visit to the historical Castle Frankenstein, to which I don't think holds a lot of weight. I also think that there are some accusations in this about Mary Shelley not being a very inventive writer, which I think is kind of weird and silly. But that being said, I love this book for all of the other information. Like, there's a lot of, like, travel log information. I love the way that it examines, like, Mary Shelley's life, Mary and Percy, and that entire summer is so fascinating because you've got James Polidori there, who wrote The Vampire, which became a big influence on Dracula, and then you also have Lord Byron there, and all these larger-than-life characters, and it's so fun to read about their exploits, and just imagining the nights that they had together, just drinking and revelry and going kind of crazy. And I also really enjoyed how it explored just like other alchemists who may have inspired Dr. Frankenstein, and I thought all of that was really interesting. I think this is a really fun book if you are a nerd for good old Frankenstein, but it's not as essential a read as In Search of Dracula because, like I said, In Search of Dracula changed how we view Dracula in pop culture. So, it is a very vital book for that. The only other Frankenstein book that I read is The Rivals of Frankenstein, which doesn't actually feature Frankenstein. It's a bunch of short stories that are in the vein of Frankenstein. And I think this book is really good. Like, this was kind of a surprise. There are a total of 11 stories in this collection, and some of them I love. The very first story in this, by Clark Ashton Smith, is a story about a mad scientist who creates like a giant colossus, like a giant flesh golem that destroys and rampages through a countryside, and I loved that. I thought that was like a great story. I didn't think any of these were particularly bad. The reason that I own this actually was because of Dr. Karnstein's creation, which was by Donald F. Glut. And that one is really funny because it's basically a supposed relative of Frankenstein showing up to Transylvania to try and, like, in order to make another monster like Frankenstein did. But the problem is it's Transylvania and he accidentally makes a Frankenstein Dracula. So it's hilarious. It's amazing. Frankenstein, like a vampire. It's just more fun to call it a Frankenstein Dracula. Okay? Give me a break. This one also includes a story by H.P. Lovecraft, which is Herbert West Reanimator. I had never read any of Lovecraft, and after reading this, I don't think I'm going to go back and do it. This story is good. Like, it is interesting because I've obviously seen this film Reanimator, and I was kind of curious to read this story just because of that. I knew that H.P. Lovecraft was a very, very racist person. But I didn't realize how it's in every page. Like, he's super duper racist, and this story goes into some very uncomfortable things, and it always kind of makes me, I don't know, it's one of those things where it's like, it's very distracting. You know what? I don't know. I think I'm good with Lovecraft. I like what other people have done with Lovecraft. I don't really need to read Lovecraft. But other than that, a pretty fun collection. Not a lot of none of the other names are very recognizable. Although obviously there's like Robert Bloch. So Robert Bloch is the other one who's like a pretty big one. This one, I love this book. So this is The Witching of Dracula. This is actually number 6 in a series that I haven't read any others in. This is pure pulp. This is such good pulp. And it's so pulpy, there is a cigarette ad still in the middle of this book. And I think if you need to know anything more about this book, you don't, because there's a cigarette ad in the middle of this book. That's how pulp this is. I want to find all the other entries in this series because it sets up such an interesting world. And I was like, what? So in this book, where we are, so The Witching of Dracula, this is Elizabeth Bathory. She's been revived. She got released. And this guy in America, he is in a wheelchair, but he's also psychic. And what he is doing is they have captured him and his entourage, which includes a lady who's also a cat, and like an ex-cop Puerto Rican bodyguard man, who is dope. And they have captured Dracula, and this dude who's a psychic, the gentleman in the wheelchair, he has made it so that there was at one point, I don't know when, somebody stabbed Dracula with a stake, right? So now, whenever that stake got removed, but a sliver of it still remains in his chest. So this dude has like a psychic thing where he can just use his psychic powers to just put the stake back in Dracula's chest, or take it out and put it back in. And basically he's got kind of like quote-unquote control over Dracula. And he frees Dracula because they hear about Bathory from one of their associates. And then Dracula's like, oh, we gotta go take it out. And then they go to this castle and they have a giant battle with Elizabeth Bathory. It's so fun. You got people getting their heads cleaved in with swords. Like, it's brutal. It's exciting. It's fun. It's pulpy. I really want to read the rest of this book. It's pulp, so like you won't be like going out and being like, wow, my life has changed. But it's a very entertaining read. The Dracula Archives by Raymond Rudorf. Kind of where I kind of started to stumble a little bit and like kind of make it so that maybe I won't read all of these that I had. So there's still probably about 5 or 6 other Dracula books, probably for another month, that I just have put away, because this is not a bad book. There's nothing bad about this book, but this despite only being about, so 208 pages, it feels really, really slow. It feels like a slow book, and because it feels kind of slow, it just made it just made me be like, okay, like, I don't want to do this again. And this is this is kind of told in a similar way as Bram Stoker's Dracula, in that it's an epistolary text, and it is just all these very slow, contemplative journal entries from people who are like slowly going towards like stuff. And Dracula doesn't even show up until like 150 pages in. Again, this was a good book, but it was a slower read, and I think I was trying to read a bunch of pulp in this, and I picked this up thinking this was going to be pulp, and when it was not pulp, and was like a very slow, like trying to be legitimately creepy and like take its time, it really I think I just read this in the wrong headspace. At the very least, this is cool. I love dyed pages, and I do like the art on the front. Not a bad book, but not a great book. Also, for whatever reason, more Elizabeth Bathory's in this book as well. But not her, but her descendants, weirdly enough. Dream of Dracula. So this one I actually did talk about last month. This is A Dream of Dracula, In Search of the Living Dead by Leonard Woolf. This one is really just an academic piece, especially near the end. Half of this book is just a really interesting academic deconstruction of Dracula. But the rest of it is a lot of examining the cultural impact of Dracula in a lot of unique and innovative ways. So this was written in the 70s. Let me see. When exactly was this written? When was this written? Yeah, so this was written in 1972, the original one. This version is from 77. But this is a book that goes around and talks to people about vampires and about the cultural impacts. It goes into places that you don't expect, talking to people who are quote-unquote actual vampires, talking to individuals who are on the brink of death, talking a lot about death. There's a lot of rumination on death, especially from the author's own perspective. And then I looked it up, and he died in 2019, so that was kind of weird, reading a person talking about their own demise after they're dead. So, I mean, I guess kind of they lived on because they were talking about it. But, yeah. So that was interesting. And a lot of passes in this will, like, definitely stick with you. There's also some stuff that doesn't work in this book, mainly that he really goes all in on Guy Doré, and then you do modern day research on who Guy Doré was, and it's pretty clear that dude was framed and was not an evil vampire man. So just keep in mind, this is in the 70s. From the perspective it was written, it's still interesting. It's still a good book. Nearing the end. Count Dracula's Canadian Affair by Otto Frederick. There's a lot to talk about this book. I'm probably going to do an episode all about this book in the future. This is the rarest book I own. I had to add this on my own to Goodreads because it wasn't there. So I had to add this onto Goodreads. It's only known from being in a list by Twilight Zone. There's like a Twilight Zone magazine list way back in the day, near when it came out, as it being one of the worst books that that particular author had ever read. So it's kind of a collector's item because people are always like, whoa, what's this? It's super rare. We don't know what it is. I didn't realize how rare this is. I just bought this on eBay, and I believe I was just having some drinks, and I found this on eBay and then was like, bought it up. This book is ridiculous. I would say about half of it is like pretty good and entertaining and interesting because it's all about this frontier life. All of the horror stuff like makes no sense. Like there is like, when this book ends, I was like, wait, what? Wait, why was Dracula there? That was Dracula? Why was that lady okay with all this stuff? And like, there's a reason why I'm not going into super detail about this book, because it needs an episode all of its own. And I think like I probably need a few months, and then I need to read this again, and then just do a full, expansive series on this book, because the last third of this book makes no sense. It's called Count Dracula's Canadian Affair. We're never really clear if they've passed into Canada, because there's a lot of American military stuff. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. What is going on here? And this book is a mess, and I love it because it's a mess, and it doesn't make any sense. And you're not going to hear anyone else talk about this. If you find this, buy this, because it's super duper rare. And then you can be, like me, one of the only people on Goodreads to have ranked this. There's one other book I read, The Return of the Wolfman, which I don't own. I had to read it via archive.org. It's a pretty hard one to get a hold of. But you can read it on archive.org for free. So I really recommend you do that if you're at all interested in Universal Monsters, because it is a serious sequel to Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. So Jeff Roven is a pretty well-known-ish horror writer from an era. At least I had heard of him. I believe Joshua from Coffee Cats and Kings was talking about him because he wrote some kind of like giant vampire bat novel. And I've seen some of his other works just kind of like roaming around. So I think he's decently well known, but he really manages to do some very interesting things in this book, where this is a book that pretty much like combines the entire Universal Monsters canon. There are references to the Deadly Mantis in here. There are references to the Creature from the Black Lagoon in here. There are references to things that aren't even technically Universal films, like White Zombie. And it brings all of these aspects together on the basis of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And the book starts at the end of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And it is a serious horror novel. And I think that's possible because Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, the one thing that's not a joke is the monsters. They treat the monsters seriously. So I think that's a really interesting thing to read. Like, especially, you will realize it if you know those movies really well, because you'll be getting to that first chapter and you're like, wait a minute. This is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And then the book itself is just really good. Like, it's a really well-paced, super quick book. Has some pretty brutal scenes. It is the Universal Monsters flavor, but written in a way that is like modern horror aesthetics in terms of like the violence, because there's some like violent stuff in there. But yeah, I thought it was interesting. I thought it was unique. I thought it really was a great capper to the entire Universal canon. In my opinion, you should have called it House of Wolfman, just because that would have gone with House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, House of Wolfman. Because this one really is all about Lawrence Talbot, the Wolfman. And this takes place in the then current times of 1997. So it ends in the 40s with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and then like kind of jumps ahead. And it's just great. It's fantastic. I had a great time reading it. I was really captivated. I kept going back. I will definitely read this again. Another book that might get a full video in the future. Final book is a honky. This is There's Something in the Blood, The Man Who Wrote Dracula by David J. Skal. I read this on audiobook actually, because I got a free trial for Scribd, and there was like and thank goodness there was an audiobook for this there, because it's a chunky book. Fascinatingly enough, I would say this is if it feels like if Stephen King wrote a book about Bram Stoker, because the actual story of Bram Stoker can probably be told in about this much pages. Dude was a private person. He did not talk to people much. He was a workaholic, and you don't really know much about the Bram Stoker other than some of the letters and stuff like that they have managed to get apart. But as you can notice, this is a big chunky book. And that's because it goes into exhaustive detail. There's so many asides. Every person that even remotely touches Bram Stoker's story gets like a full autobiography in here. Like, you get an entire autobiography of Oscar Wilde in here. And I had no idea Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker were so closely related. They don't actually interact that much, but their stories are closely related. And it goes into all about William Irving. It asks a lot of questions. It doesn't say anything in definitives, just because, again, we don't know that much about Bram Stoker, but it talks about the possibilities of his sexuality, how racist he was. And yeah, David J. Skal really just goes in depth about Bram Stoker. A lot of people don't like this book because, like I said, there's a lot of asides. It goes into exhaustive detail. It's not just a refined, singular narrative of Bram Stoker. It goes into like everything. Like, Bram Stoker is dead, and there's like still like 100 pages left of the book, and because they keep going on. And it's very funny because I don't know why he keeps going on, because David J. Skal also wrote an entire book about stage to screen, which was like how Dracula went from being a stage play to being a motion picture in 1931. And this book also goes into that. And I'm like, David, you could just end it when he dies and then say, hey, if you want more, you should read my other book. But anyway, regardless, I loved all this. Like, I was never bored during this. I found all the information interesting. Just if you're a person who only wants to learn about Bram Stoker, you're probably not going to be happy with this book because it goes into everyone else's life as well. What are your favorite Dracula books? I obviously didn't reread the original Dracula. Probably should have done that if I was doing a Dracula month, but oh well. Thank you guys for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, and remember, it came from the page.